It's been an interesting adventure to see things through this journey of as a chaplain, prison chaplain, and then now as a dad. And living in University of Sioux Falls for over 30 years now. Living in the world of ideas, where you write papers and you make statements and you pontificate, and I'm living in the ivory tower of academics, and my son is out getting shot at the mall on the day of the riot. Two very different worlds sometimes. So, suppose that's some of my thoughts, some ideas that I throw at you to get the wheels turning. Okay, John, I'll shut up now. You're up. What do you want to say?
So, a couple notes. I still my claim to fame is that I'm Dennis's kid. Even to this day, no matter where I go or who I speak to, it's always, oh, I know your dad, this. And so it's still out there. But I learned a lot as a kid watching him preach, talk in different areas, and little did I know that would help me down the road. Because again, I never figured I'd be in this position with these type of public speaking duties and these types of things. Because in many ways, the life of a police chief and a preacher are pretty similar. You got to get up and just make stuff up, not make stuff up, right? but be able to adapt, to give a sermon, to give a speech to the moment and see what's there and adapt and address the times. And so on some of the notes he talked about, you talk about calling. And I believe sometimes when we seek our calling too hard, we miss our calling, right? If I decide what my calling is, then it's a misplaced thought, right? Because as a kid growing up, I wanted to be a police officer. And you ask any 4 or 5-year-old what they want to be. It's a police officer, a firefighter, typically. And now, probably should have been a firefighter. I might have been an easier route. There's a story about when I realized I got that all wrong, but I'll save that. Well, actually, I'll just give it now. Busy day. It's working in snowstorm and accident after accident. Just no time for breaks, just running from call to call. And I really have to use the bathroom. And so I'm driving by a fire station, and I'm like, I'll just pull into the fire station and use that. And I walk in, I'm like, use the bathroom, kind of peek into the lounge area, and I see some recliners, so I wander in, and there's 3 firefighters in their recliners watching the World Series. The other one's stirring a pot of soup. Offered to have me sit down, and I'm like, I got this all wrong. That's what the calling I should have picked for myself, By the way, love the firefighters. We have this mutual admiration for each other. There's no animosity. It's actually a really good working relationship. But growing up then, I'm like, okay, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it's always like, well, I think I want to be in law enforcement, but I really didn't know for sure. And I just kind of kept moving forward. But I knew when I grew up at First Baptist Church, and I don't know if you grew up in a church, if you ever took the spiritual gift inventories, who's taken one of those? Did anybody find any truth to that in their future? Because I always came back with something service related, whether it was even like always service. And so I'm like, that's interesting. And then we go on mission trips, and fulfillment was by digging a trash pit or tearing down a wall or doing some form of tangible service to a group or a community. Didn't really register at the time. I just thought I liked doing that stuff. So I go to college and still have law enforcement in the back of my mind, go to University of Sioux Falls, and again, no 18-year-old actually knows what they're up to. And if they do, I think it's going to change within a year, but I'm like, okay, there's no criminal justice major. I'm just here to play football. And I got a smoking tuition deal since my dad worked there at about 90% off. I'd be a fool not to go here. And go through and choose a business major eventually and go through this, but still law enforcement's in the back of my mind. Well, meet my future wife, and toyed with just the question I toyed with ministry for a bit. Like, maybe I want to be a youth pastor. There was a couple experiences throughout that really knocked that out of me. So I was a summer rep for USF, went to church camps, had a great experience going to church camps all summer. And then I became a youth intern at First Baptist Church for the middle schoolers. If you want to get pushed out of ministry, be a middle school youth intern. And then you'll decide that your youth ministry is not for you, right? But then at one point, I was the chaplain for the USF choir, and I had to do a devotional, and it was on light. And so I'm like, well, I got this ace in the hole, right? I got my dad's the campus pastor. He can just hand me a devotional. It'll be perfect. I won't even have to do anything. He gives me this thing about missionaries stuck in holes and all sorts of stuff. Like, this is a terrible devotional for my audience, right? So I rewrite the whole thing, do that. I'm like, maybe ministry isn't for me. But getting close to the end of my college career, I'm met who I'm going to get married, my wife Melissa, and there's a certain stability to Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, that you do not find in public safety. And I tell all cops before they start, be okay with two things. This job could kill you, and your days off and your hours are going to stink. And if you're not okay with these two things, don't even apply, right? And so, certain stability Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. And so I get out of college, get this sales job, and I'm like, I owe it a fair shake. And so I'm like, well, I can do this. I'll stick it out for 2 years, and then I'll make a move from there. Nothing worth doing is worth doing, and I learned this in college. You better commit to it, and you better be uncomfortable even if you don't like it. Well, within a month, I was waking up in the morning, going to the bathroom, and vomiting before I went to work. Because anybody who worked the job, you just see, not that I hated it, I wasn't treated poorly, but this is not where my calling is. This is not where my future is. This is not what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I'm like, but you will do this for 2 years no matter what, right? You will do it. And so keep working, work through that period. About a little over a year in, my wife looks at me and she's like, you're pretty miserable, aren't you, with your job? I'm like, yeah, it's not what I'm supposed to be doing. And my wife went to college, got a journalism degree, was working as a production assistant at Kello. I'm like, you're not very happy with your job, are you? She's like, no, all I ever wanted to do was go to hair school. That's what she wanted to do. And so, like, let's change our lives. So she went to hair school. I started applying for the police department, and on the 2-year anniversary of when I started that sales job, I was walking out the door, exactly 2 years. I gave them a solid 2-month notice because you quit everything well. Another lesson from life. It doesn't matter what you do, quit it well and quit it with respect to who you work with. And then started my career in law enforcement and immediately knew that this is the service-driven life or work that I was after. And again, the other factors that I had talked about the days, that was worth the sacrifice. That's where I found that my calling was. And I could fill an hour with this, but I don't want to fill up your time because I want to get to questions and stuff too. But all I ever wanted to be was to be a cop. And then that came true. And I never thought I'd be police chief ever. Because again, I think with callings, we sometimes shoot way into the future with what we think we should be doing rather than what's in the moment. And this motto that comes through, do the best with what you have, with what you can do in front of you, and let everything else take care of itself. And so just keep working forward towards where you're at. Maybe where you think you're headed isn't where you should be headed. And I'm like, well, I want to be a detective because every cop thinks that that's like the funnest job that you can have in law enforcement. It's a mountain of paperwork, for one thing. So I was 0 for 6. I think I had this reputation as a golden boy, like I got everything I put in for. I was 0 for 6 in detective bureau applications, right? It's not where I was meant to be. Instead, I ended up trending towards training, got on the SWAT team about 4 or 5 years in, and I'm like, oh, this is my niche, the tactical aspect of things, the niche of this kind of problem solving and being an instructor in all these different disciplines. So that ended up being my SWAT career of almost 11 years of being on the SWAT team, which you talk about how decisions in the past meet the moment, and then numerous times being in the position of critical incidents, not just the riots, but other multiple critical incidents. I'm like, oh yeah, this is where I was headed. I thought I was going this direction, but this is where I needed to be. And so you can just look at things sometimes, and who knows what lies ahead. I know, like I said, you do what's in front of you, and you take care of what's there. And when Chief Burns announced his retirement, I'm like, well, I believe I'm positioned, right? That if service to my community is what drives me, and service to my profession is what drives me, then this is where I need to be, and this is where I'll put my application in, and where chips fall, they fall. And that's kind of the story of how you end up to be the chief of police when you never really thought you'd be the chief of police. You're just cutting meat at Hy-Vee in college, wondering what you were going to do for a life, And so, that's calling. It's an interesting topic, and again, I think we could fill it a lot of time. And he could throw scripture at it, and I can throw, life stories about it, but that's about it. So. But yeah, it's interesting, like the service calling mindset, and you see it within officers in particular. Like there's people, I just say they're down for the cause. Like what drives them is the cause. Like, and they can't imagine doing anything else, the cause. And I think teaching other professions can be like that too. Like nobody teaches for the money, but the cause drives them, right? And the impact they have on people's lives. I think that's what we try to find in our professions, is that what you do is a cause that drives you.
Yeah. And it's interesting when I think about popularity-wise, as we become more and more of a post-church culture, what we're seeing across the nation is fewer and fewer people in the college level wanting to even go into theology majors, youth ministry majors. Numbers are on the decline. Seminaries are closing or transitioning, as we've seen in Sioux Falls, into a different style of seminary. A lot of non-trads, non-traditional. Being a minister is not the most popular thing in our culture. In fact, there's a hostility towards it. Being a police officer is not necessarily the most popular thing. A lot of times people would walk up to either of us and say, "Why?" Two things. "Oh, the world needs more people like you," and pat you on the head. And then, "Why would you ever want to do that?" But it's interesting how life takes you in a direction you don't know for sure. But that's, kind of as we think about that, that leads us to other questions that you may have. I'm sure most of which are going to go this direction, and I'm fine with that. I'm 69. I know I'm in the final years of my journey here. I don't plan on dying anytime soon, but I do plan on retiring sometime soon. But anyhow, feel free to direct your questions at John. What do you have that's been stimulated by this?
Just one more statement about what you just said about why would you do this job and why would you. So again, I taught a class at USF for 2 semesters. And I've got, in one session it was 40 plus students who were criminal justice, sociology majors, some social work majors, a few others mixed in. The other was about 20 during COVID, which this reminds me of COVID, because teaching a class during COVID, you just stare out a mask and just want to, there's no interaction, right? And I think that's what we've lost sometimes with this, not complaining. But teaching is really hard, again, to the teachers who teach during COVID, because it's really a difficult thing. But I'm like, hey, who wants to be a street cop? I'd ask the classes. Nobody raises their hand. Yeah, there you go. You're up. Yeah, there you go. Let's sign you up. Because now in for youth today, right? They understand what that means to be a street cop. They understand that the suffering that goes along with it. In today's society, today's youth are very focused on the holistic of their life, right? Like many people in this room, we're willing to suffer for their job. Like I'm going to suffer for my job because it provides for my family and that pension that's out there, like everything that's going to drive it. I'm going to grind through this. Well, today's are like, well, you mean I'm not going to have weekends off? I can't have every day off I want. Yeah. And so finding that balance now of people who are willing to suffer for their profession and professions that require suffering is very difficult. And so I think you see there's a shift, and you'll hear me if I get on the news anytime I can. We're like, hey, we need to do some hiring incentives. We need to find ways to make our schedules work a little bit better to make this more attractive. There we go. We need to sell the purpose-driven work that's there, not just that it's driven by a paycheck, because that's what young people want right now. And so I think it's something that we kind of have to work through, because finding people who are willing in a variety of things too. There's numerous other disciplines that you're going to see. Again, I've got 2 brothers that are doctors, and I'm a cop, right? And no one's questioning them why they chose their profession. Like, oh yeah, that's why you chose that, right? Because that's a pretty good job. And people always say to me, they're like, wait a second, your twin's a doctor, you're a doctor, what happened to you? And I'm like, I got hit in the head a lot. Like football.
Not by me.
Not by you, no. He was all body blows, right? No, but the math and science portion of my brain just isn't there. It just wasn't something that clicked with me. There's other things that we have that click with us, but now, my brother's coworkers, the anesthesiologists, kind of tease him a little bit now, because they're like, oh, well, your one brother's a surgeon, the other's the chief of police. You're just an anesthesiologist. Does that make you the, does that make you the Cooper Manning of the trio? It's again, it's just in fun. But yeah, let's again, questions. Like I said, nobody wants to hear us talk forever, and usually there's some pretty good questions that'll spark conversation.
Who had a question?
Yeah.
Just a second.
Yeah.
Is your favorite TV show Blue Bloods?
No, it's not actually. So people always ask me, and people love that show. I don't watch a lot of cop shows anymore because there's problems with them sometimes. I watch them and I see the holes, and then I see some of the messaging that just kind of comes through, and I'm like, it just ends up being not an enjoyable experience for me anymore. There was a couple shows that I liked. They were police related.
Dukes of Hazzard when you were
Dukes
3
of
years old.
Hazzard.
7 o'clock Friday night, it was like we were childless because there was watching Boss Hogg.
But there's some that are kind of fun, when they have that element of things. But there's just, again, I like it. But there's like some movies that I don't watch either because I'm like, I don't want to. It's not entertainment for me anymore. But yeah, there's a bunch of people that love Blue Bloods, by the way. Tom Selleck, I guess, is quite the character in that movie. Actually, it's pretty good. Yeah.
Over the past couple of years, we've seen police chiefs across the country being interviewed on television,
Yep.
usually regarding an officer of theirs. And the problem is, you didn't do it soon enough, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. And there's so much judgment, and it's basically probably a political thing.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you deal with something, as simple as that? It should be simple, but it gets very complex.
Well, we just had a recent an incident that I had to deal with within the first 6 months, and you try to be as upfront as you can with what you have, right? But really understand this, and I kind of made this statement. Regardless of who we are or where we work, we employ human beings, and human beings make decisions, human beings make mistakes, and we can only control sometimes our response to that. And that's what I think it's important to note and point out, that we have to make these decisions based on what's there. And we can be right, and there's high consequence professions, I call them. Like in law enforcement, we can be right 99.9% of the time, but when we make a mistake, it's very, very catastrophic. Same thing with surgeons. Like surgeons can be right 99.9% of the time, they're gonna make a mistake, and mistakes can be catastrophic. The difference is sometimes when a surgeon makes a mistake, it's a big malpractice lawsuit. When an officer makes a mistake, it's criminal charges and a civil lawsuit. And so it's just this balance of high consequence profession. And we just have to recognize that, again, another reason why people don't want to be cops, it's a high consequence profession. You really don't have a lot of grace for your mistakes. And we've seen it too, and I won't get into too much detail, but with the officer who mistakenly drew her firearm rather than her taser. Like, we watched that the next day, and that's like, yep, like, we knew what was gonna happen, high consequence profession. But again, watching that, and even after the trial went through, I don't think any objective person really thinks that wasn't a mistake. And I can even tell you from a defensive tactics, from a standpoint of watching officer behavior, what's happening. But again, like, that's where we don't always get the most objective view of the issue that happened. It gets clouded by other things too. So again, yeah, I would be naive to think, right? I was hoping I wouldn't have to have a press conference in the first 6 months, but they've thrown a lot at me in 6 months. We've had multiple officer-involved shootings. We've had other things that have happened and things that are, so I guess it's trial by fire, and you may as well get your new operational tempo and get acclimated to that sort of stuff and just be ready for it, because it's going to happen. You're going to have to get in front and really take responsibility for your department and what happened, and really be as transparent and open as you can.
And this is an interesting thing that when you think about 42 years ago, when I was in my last semester of seminary, and then after that, as I went back to seminary for postgraduate work, I never did we even have the conversation about misconduct. And interestingly, parallel in the two fields, 42 years ago, those things don't happen. Or if they do happen, we have ways of covering it up, or we just move on. And it was assumed, everybody was well-intentioned in both professions, that there were no bad guys. It was a clear bad guy, good guy kind of a line.
Yep.
And again, telling the truth is a part of seeking justice. And I went through seminary and postgraduate work never having a discussion of sexual misconduct in the clergy. Not even a conversation about it. So, we talk about how the world is going to hell in a handbasket and everything's blowing apart and all that stuff. On the other hand, there is one thing, like Martin Luther King Jr. said, the moral arc of the universe moves towards justice. And in both professions, we're starting to speak the truth. The trick is to actually speak the truth and not go like all ministers are sexual predators, all cops are bad cops.
Yeah, it was just a point that I often talk about is like there's a couple professions that receive different scrutiny, in clergy, law enforcement, lawyers, right? Oh,
Yeah.
Any lawyers in here before I open my mouth? No, just kidding. No, just kidding. And so politicians sometimes fall in that too, right? And so the lawyers and other people, to whom much responsibility and trust is given, higher the consequence. However, we still kind of see, again, and I'm kind of using teachers here, like teachers, we kind of default to their goodness. Like I can show you numerous articles about teacher-student sex scandals or teacher-student things, right? But the general line is that, oh yeah, teachers are good people because we have this internal thing about, okay, we want to trust. Even nurses, right? Like nurses too, high levels of drug abuse within nurses, different issues like that. I'm not saying like most nurses are good, we default to that. And even though, like I say, people act like I'm some sort of anomaly as a cop because I'm a nice guy and personable, I've worked with way better people than me, right? And I got all these like, especially during George Floyd, I get text messages from people who live out of town. They're like, oh, well, we know you're different, this and that. I go, no, there's better people than John Toom that work for that police department. In fact, that, I always tell the story, like some of the guys I've worked with, like I'm amazed at their goodness. And because we're in church, I can say this, they're godly people who really strive for God, right? And I'm like, oh, no, there's great people everywhere. And let's not just cast upon some people because it's easier for us to say this is bad, Like I said, and again, it's same thing with clergy and with other professions too. But again, the playbook, the rules, right? And as a cop, as a preacher, you understand the scrutiny that's there, higher the consequence, right? And you just live your life in a way that you understand that going in. It's not a surprise, right? Like we're not going to be just surprised by this.
I've been really impressed by seeing you out in the public so much. And it's got to be difficult to get that balance with, all the administrative things you have to do at the police department, and then all of the things you do in the community. Tell us about how you decide what you're going to do. You must have a plan as far as community stuff.
Oh, sure. So I kind of said, and I told my wife this too, I go, within the first year, and I hope not too many people are watching this, I'm going to say yes to about everything, right? Because it's important within that first year to make as many contacts as you can, as much as you can get out there, and try to navigate this to see where you're at. Well, I found that that's impossible, and I think you'll see it with our mayor too. Our mayor is highly visible, highly out there. Like, I don't even know how he does it, because it's really hard to get to everything. So now, while I've had to miss a few events, I try to like pick and choose and see what's there. But there's been a couple where I've been like, no, I really need to do this with my kids. And somebody else can pick up the slack, but at the same time getting out there and doing it. Because the reality is that, has anybody in the room ever been an officer, a firefighter, or worked in kind of, your family suffers for your profession too. Like, they really do. And so you have to find a way to make sure you balance that. And that's kind of the question. And I think what I found out is Chief Burns did such a good job of assembling his command staff, which I got to inherit. And there's such great resources for me in guideposts to kind of tell me, okay, but they also recognize that I'm going to do things a little different, and I'm going to do things my way too. And so their guidance and their ability to take care of some of those administrative tasks gives me a little more freedom to say, you know what, well, I'm going to come talk to First Presbyterian Church on Sunday morning, and then Monday I'll go to Martin Luther King. But I can't make this festival, but I'm going to make this one and try to do that, because I think people want to see a police chief. And again, I'm from this community. This is, again, I think there was some discussion, well, are you going to open up a nationwide search? And I think internally we're like, no, this is our community. Like, I think we were like, we want to promote from within. We want to promote our culture and who we are. Yeah. But yeah, so it's a balancing act, because like I said, my kids, especially in some ways, my job is a little easier right now, because as the SWAT commander, it was like the drop of a hat. I'd have to go, and just leave the kids, do whatever, and do what needed to be done. At least I know where I'm going usually this time now, so I have enough time to plan and be there. But there was one time it still sticks me, and this is, so my wife went back to hair school, so I would have the kids on my days off. So I typically had Wednesday, Thursday, or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday off. Fun fact, in 16 years in law enforcement, never worked at Thanksgiving. Not because I got them off all the time, because my days off always stinked. So I just always had Thanksgiving off, So I'm like building up all week with the kids. Hey, on my day off, we're going to do something special. It's going to be a surprise. You're going to do this, just trying to build anticipation for it. They're just little guys at this point, and I was going to take them to Secret Life of Pets. because I wanted to see it too. You know, I still like animated animal movies, you know. So finally, you know, that day comes, get him in the car. I'm like, hey, we're going to Secret Life of Pets. And 3 blocks from the house, pager goes off, right? And I'm just like, oh, sorry, guys, you know. And see, you think about those moments and those things and the sacrifices that you make for your profession, because your whole family does it. And so people are like, well, how long are you going to do this profession? And I'm like, well, that's a great question. The average life expectancy for a police chief career is about 3 years, which means I'll be taking early retirement. No,
Retire together.
that's not the case. Yeah, retire together. Yeah, we'll have to move in together too after that. So it's not another police department in town for me to work for. But you know, but like, oh, why do police officers or firefighters, why do they retire, and why is that retirement age so early? I think that's part of it, right? You can't sustain that, and you miss out with a lot, and so. Again, the balance of all this is very tricky, and I haven't nailed it all the time. Like I said,
How do you determine, because like you said, you get so many asks to
Yep.
come out into the community, so how do you prioritize those?
I just default on saying yes until some other conflict comes up. And for example, I got invited to the Ethiopian Day Festival, so I went there, and then they invited me to a follow-up thing like a month later, and I'm like, I'm doing something with my kids that day, so I'm not making that one, right? So I just kind of prioritize them like that. But again, it's, I have Rotary next week, and then the week after that I have another one, and I didn't even know there was a cosmopolitan club in town, but I guess that's a thing. I don't even, so you just keep working the circuit a little bit, and again, never turn down an invitation is kind of my thing, or if I do, find an alternate time to do it.
How has the COVID virus affected Sioux Falls Police Department?
So when I got promoted to lieutenant in 2019, I skipped being a shift lieutenant, and I went straight to basically special operations lieutenant. I'm like, oh, what a fortunate job. This is a great, I'm not on a shift. I'm Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. This is a great deal. And then that fall was like, wow, I'm really enjoying this job. And then in the spring, I found out that I'm responsible for our COVID response. And I'm like, oh, this is miserable. And then I'm responsible for protests and riots too, right? So 2020 set up to be a really difficult year. But as we've navigated this, and it's interesting because it's looking at society, and law enforcement and first responders were the first ones to have to just say, all right, we're going to suck it up. We got to deal with it, right? And so I remember being responsible for this. The first call came out for a COVID positive guy that we had to go deal with. And so the cops roll out, and putting on the N95s, putting on the gloves, putting on the eye goggles. We literally didn't know what we were dealing with at that point. We were still fairly concerned that 50% of us were going to die if we got it, you know, because you remember the hype of the early stuff. We just didn't know. But then watching after a couple weeks, it just becomes situation normal. Like, okay, this is just what we do. And then our response change and our mitigation efforts, and we never had a serious hit to our workforce that really required emergency staffing or anything of that nature. And then eventually it just became normal. But figuring out all these processes before we got there was really, because there was no playbook for law enforcement pandemic response. And coordinating with Metro Communications, with fire, with our emergency operations center, with health, to really do this. And I don't say this to dismiss COVID, because what is the death toll now for our country? 800,000+ people, I believe, right? Yeah. And my father-in-law died of COVID, and I've seen the effects of COVID. But in many ways for us, this was a great practice run for something in the future that could be even worse. Like, we got to establish procedures and practices and really think about this in a hard way before we got something that had a more lethal rate, right? That was more effective to either youth or young people. I said early on in COVID, imagine the hysteria we would happen if this was damaging our kids, and how much differently people would have responded. So again, it's been interesting, but right now I would say cases are very, very high. And of course it mirrors society. Like, we have this just running wild right now, and thankfully of the officers, we've had a couple that have got pretty sick, ended up on oxygen, but no deaths. And now this round, as we see, because we get to kind of watch the study a little bit, a lot of mild cases affecting our officers right now. So
In view of the rising crime rates in the major cities
Yep.
and the district attorneys that are choosing not to prosecute obvious crimes, and the fact that in Minneapolis, the good news was 55% voted to not disband the police department. The bad news was 44% voted to disband the police department.
Yep.
How do you recruit under these circumstances, the quality of people you are seeking?
So if you go to siouxfalls.org in the police department and go to our recruitment page, it's worth taking a look at, because we've been very intentional on how we've constructed this. And we are selling primarily our community and the fact that the community supports us. In fact, I shot a video and I watched it after it was done, and it was a series of questions. I just recorded stuff. And if you go through and count the amount of times I say community in this 3-minute video, like, it's just again and again and again, because like this is the truth, is that we see, and again, we tend to look at all of these issues as all or none issues. And let's just talk about defund the police first. It was an all or none issue for many of these areas. We have to do this because of this. Well, the reality is that the truth laid in the middle. Like, you can't expect better results with less workforce and less money. Like, yeah, but back to teachers again, or nurses. Yeah, we want better nursing with less education and less of them doing it. It's not going to work. It's not going to work, right? But we can't just pretend like there's not some happy compromise. And I still say with many things, if you came to me as an administrator and showed me a piece of paper where I give up funding for 6 of my officer positions, and in return I never have to go to a mental health call again, show me where to sign, right? Because yeah, there's a balance somewhere in there. Because in law enforcement, if society doesn't have somebody to deal with the problem, guess who gets to deal with it? Law enforcement. So law enforcement response to mental health. We are some of the best trained people outside of qualified mental health professionals to deal with mental health issues, because we've adjusted and adapted to what our job title is, all the way back from when mental health reform started in when? The 70s? Right? So we've been adjusting ever since. But again, if society wants to pick up the mantle and say, no, we want to create this, like, by all means, but we still have a job to do, and our job isn't going to change on top of that. And so again, as I recruit, like, you know, as we as an agency form our message, we point out that our crime rates are actually rising proportionally to our population. In fact, this year, our aggravated assaults, simple assaults are down, right, as a whole. Our homicides are down by 48% or something like that. We went from 13 to 6. And so we're like, okay, here's our community, here's the support we have, here's the $50+ million training center that in the height of all this defund movement, we were actually investing in as a community, because we understand it's not an all or none. On top of that, we'll stand up the link, which you heard about last week. We'll stand up this program, the new 988 mental health line that's going to come out, like the different things that are happening. It's a broad spectrum approach. And again, I understand how we got where we got from these other metro areas, but they're now refunding their police.
You know, there's an interesting irony. Before I married John's mom, and I was this super idealistic seminarian who wanted to change the world, I actually left seminary and moved to Portland to work with an urban ministry in the poorest part of town. So this is late 70s. Portland at that time was not the Portland we know today. Portland, I lived in the roughest part of town. I'd go to the park on a Sunday afternoon, be the only white guy in the park, being invited to play pickup basketball. It was an interesting time. And when a police car would pull into the neighborhood, the kids would run towards the car because the cops were giving out sports cards, things like that. I would ride around with a car full of black guys on a Friday night, and there was no talk about worrying about the police. What happened was I came back to seminary to finish up because I knew I needed to finish up. Interestingly, I always wanted to go back to work. I haven't been back to Portland since, but I know what hit. Within 2 years after I left Portland, crack cocaine hit. The neighborhood that I lived in, that I felt incredibly safe in, totally changed within a couple of years, and it was all related to the drug traffic. There was no crack cocaine in Portland that I knew of in the late 70s. And then within a matter of 2 years, I was reading about my old neighborhood, and it totally changed. So police changed when the neighborhood changed, when drugs brought in a whole new level of crazy that hadn't been there before. When I worked at the penitentiary, I started in 1987, and I worked there until 1991. The number one reason why people came in was alcohol issues, alcohol-related issues. And there was, of course, that's changed now, right? So, you know, a lot of times we talk about these cultural changes, and we're starting to now have an intelligent conversation about defunding the police won't fix everything. I don't think we're dealing very well with addiction, you know, and our addictive culture that we're in.
Yeah, and so we'll piggyback on that, right? It's again, if there's a problem that's not defined, whose problem is it?
Yeah.
It's law enforcement's, right? So let's take a Sioux Falls example. Crack isn't a huge issue here, right? Heroin's not even a huge issue here. Right now, I'll still say the single most destructive drug to our society that drives most police work is alcohol. Most groups, you stole it from me. I was going to ask them.
Sorry.
And inevitably, somebody says meth, right? Because meth is what we are told is driving all the problems. Well, meth causes problems, don't get me wrong, right? But alcohol drives most everything. And so let's look at the Bishop Dudley neighborhood. Let's look at the Whittier Park neighborhood. And when that first opened, there was, you know, outraged community about the effect on the neighborhood. And we as police came in, and there was an expectation that police were just going to solve this issue. Well, we can't arrest out of addiction and mental health, right? And so as a sergeant at the time, I'm like, we need to change the narrative on this. And so every time I'd get a chance to talk in front of people, and I still do now, I go, the drivers of this neighborhood it's not a police solved issue, which is hard for police to say sometimes. We can't solve this issue. It's alcohol and mental health. Rather than syringes on every street corner, it's tall cans of malt liquor. And this is what drives these issues. And until we're honest with people in our community and in the neighborhood and say, yeah, like we can't solve this one for you. This is a community approach and a community effort that's going to have to happen to work on these issues and how we up our game and introduce the link, right? Introduce other things that we try. But to expect these to be blanket, like to change the lives of an entire group of people is naive.
Yeah.
Success is measured in individuals, and it's not measured in statistics. And so you have to take that when you go into it and understand that. But I think now if you go to the neighborhood, they're like, yeah, the cops are doing all they can. This is a bigger problem than law enforcement can handle. You know, and I think that's part of how we set up people's expectations so they understand the issues at play.
My question sort of relates to that. As you said last week, we had somebody from the Link come and talk to us. Talk from your perspective about what that has done for the force, the police force, that partnership. She was very complimentary of the force and the cooperation with you. I just wondered what you think that's doing for your job and the police force.
And so again, it comes back to they've had, did she give you the stats on how many intakes they've done? Like it's mind-boggling, right? It's mind-boggling, right? It's just the amount of people that are coming through there. It's still somewhat underutilized though. And I think we talked about the Operation Hope Fund, some other stuff that's out there, because the city council and the mayor's office has put massive support towards this. Avera Sanford, all the partners have put such great support to it. And I think what we have to realize too is I walk through the first time and I'm like, yeah, this is a great thing, but nothing we roll out is a finished product, right? Like it's going to evolve through time. We're going to see where it's more effective and see how we can be even better with it. But you can't get better until you build the machine, so to speak, and then start to change it a little bit. And then we're seeing, you know, learning from our mistakes. And I think partnerships are there. Our partnership with the Link, our partnership with Southeast Behavioral Health, our partnership with the school district kind of models this community-wide approach where we are working on bigger issues as a team as opposed to in our own silos. And I think that's what we have to do moving forward, is especially when it comes to homelessness in town. Opening up a new shelter will simply increase the homeless population. Like we see people from around the region and country arrive in Sioux Falls because of our great compassionate services that we offer. I mean, and that's okay, right? That mirrors who we are as a society. That mirrors who we are in the Upper Midwest. We are compassionate, I'll say maybe to a fault sometimes, right? Like we give and give, But at the same time, we have to have like a realistic expectation that more beds doesn't equal more success. It maybe equals more population.
Yeah.
So how we focus holistically as a community between the different stakeholders to say, okay, especially there's different segments too. Here's your probably your top 20 who are horribly addicted to alcohol, but how do we impact that community, that group, to have the most impact for our society and take an intelligent approach to it. But the link I'm excited for, and I think, again, we're just going to see where that facility is going to go. I know there's a whole floor above it that is ready to be developed, right? So we'll see how they adapt their services and how they go forward with that.
At 92, I still think you have pretty good physical ability there. You look like you work out.
I still work out. I'll tell you this though, a funny story. My kids play soccer, and when you're a young guy, you're like, oh, I'll never slow down. But the other day, I took them to the park to play soccer, and I can't run like I used to. And the kids are like, Dad, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, it just happens, man. I don't know how to tell you. I can't run anymore.
The turning point comes when all of a sudden your 16-year-old son can get you on your back and pin you.
Yeah, exactly.
I used to be able to pin them, and then I knew the times changed. But
And also, do your children realize their daddy has a dangerous job, or are they aware of that?
You know, they kind of rode through the most dangerous parts of my career when they were younger, right? Because they're 11, 9, and 7. And so there's a certain bit of like just childhood, you know, they're just a little bit naive to it. But even you look at how kids deal with stuff and how they respond to stuff. Well, in the past year, they've lost their step-grandpa, their aunt, their other grandpa, another uncle, right? And like to watch kids deal and understand with death a little bit is kind of an interesting thing to watch. And so they know that the job is dangerous, but I don't think they quite grasp it, which is okay. Because maybe down the road they can be like, okay, well let's talk about this a little bit. But I think it's like the night of the riots, my wife was obviously pretty concerned. I think they were sleeping soundly in their beds because they didn't need to know about that. They didn't need to know what was happening. And so, again, I think they understand, but they're still little kids, and that's okay. They can stay there, although they're getting bigger. I don't know.
one thing I noticed with college students, having worked with college students now for 31 years, that you talked about this Gen Z wanting the jobs with better pay, better time off, better freedom. There is a bit of a sheltered naivete that comes, that I'm looking at a lot of gray and bald heads in this room, that a lot of us, I'm 69, right? We remember the stories of the Great Depression, the polio epidemic, and if you talk to international students, if you talk to immigrant students, we have a lot of first-generation students that have come from other countries. They have a greater grasp of reality than a lot of our kids growing up in our culture. We can go out of our way to shelter them. We need to speak about addiction, and we need to speak the truth about our history and deal with justice. We're going to help our kids face reality without that being overwhelming to them, because you're also seeing mental health issues among college students off the charts as well. But it's a hard world.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, and I talk to people sometimes, I'm like, let's not get too caught up in what we're doing right now as a society, because we are very easily divided. We are very easily whipped into a frenzy on a variety of issues. And I'm like, take yourself back for a moment. Imagine being 18 in 1940 and watching two empires take over the world and having serious conversation about where you're going or what the future of your country is based on these huge global conflicts. I go, imagine being a kid, 18, waiting for your draft card to go to Vietnam and to understand that thing. Imagine living through these moments, and then take yourself right now, and we are not special. Right? Yeah. Like if anything, like our history is full of things. I remember as a kid going to the old courthouse museum and looking at a picture of a small boy in an iron lung from polio.
Yeah.
Then I'm like, imagine being a kid when that was a possibility.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think we get so caught up in what we're doing right at this moment that we forget the history in the past, and we're naive maybe to what other struggles have been out there.
Yeah, like your grandpa, my dad, couldn't go beyond the 8th grade.
Yep.
Because Great Depression, no, it's not an option. Always frustrated. Talk about vocation. My dad didn't want to be a farmer. It was just kind of what he was stuck with by virtue of his dad dying when my dad was 16, and so my dad wanted me to go to college. So I was a first-generation college student, and you look at what we've been through as a culture, and a lot of people just don't even have enough current knowledge of history to know what's all that transpired in the last 100 years.
Even back to calling, right? So, like my grandparents' role in getting, for example, you to where you're at, your role in getting your kids where they're at. Like this is generational that we build on, and then we position for success and produce a calling. And I as part of my job responsibilities, I would do orientations, and this is back a few years ago at Lutheran Social Services for New Americans. And so refugees would come in, and then I'd get an hour with them as a police officer to talk about where they're from and how law enforcement works here, because it's very, very different. So this group would come in, and I'd come in uniform, and I have an hour. I can't give them all the information in an hour, especially with like multiple translators happening at the same time. I just want them to know 2 messages, is that the police are here to help, and this is not like it is in your old country, and that success is possible because we are the product of refugees, right?
Right.
Like fleeing Eastern Europe at that time, and like we are generational success stories of immigrants and refugees. But then for them to understand that success can be achieved even faster now because of technology and education and the things that are there. Like it's a real story of hope, to see that. And we have one officer, he's a Serbian refugee, and he's my favorite story. Like this is a kid who fled as his hometown was being overtaken during that conflict, got through in a truck, carted across the border, ended up in Germany, reunited with his family, comes to Sioux Falls. His parents work at, I think it was Sanford Hospital, I may get the hospital wrong, in hospitality services to get their kids through high school. And now here he is, first generation refugee on the police department SWAT team, like a phenomenal guy and a phenomenal success story. So just talk about context and putting things in place.
We have one last question.
What advice do you have for helping, so I teach at Washington High School and Southeast Tech College, helping those young people feel free to speak the truth, to have those conversations or things like that. I think it's been a tough time the last few years to teach critical thinking and reasoning skills as well, and it's not all on them because it's been kind of a crazy bit for them. I have student, well, just from a different perspective, and like maybe a student is like looking at Colin Kaepernick and like, well, I was taught to always stand up, and then they have a Confederate flag and a QAnon sticker on their notebook, and I'm like, maybe you don't quite have the whole bit here if that's your way to be American. It's a hard thing for them to even know how to respond to, and I don't quite know how to lead that, and I'm not allowed to say all the things I used to be able to in the classroom either. So it's like trying to navigate that. But I think that is the key, and they kind of know it too, that they want to kind of have conversations and get to know people, but they don't even know how to have the conversation. Do you have advice or resources for starting that?
Yeah, it's really hard, and I think like we have to be a member of some tribe right now. Like in all our beliefs have to be dogmatically linked to this. Like I can't feel this way about this topic and not feel this way about this topic because the tribe that I'm aligned with requires me to think this way about it, right? And I can't have this approach. And I think I figured out something in law enforcement, but I think it's a universal truth to life. If you think you have all the answers and if you think you have it all figured out, you are furthest from the truth you can possibly be, right? Because we are always seeking, we are always adapting. We think about how our own minds have changed about what was a societal established norm in the 50s to what it is now. And how will history look back and judge us right now? Because we very conveniently like to look back in history and judge people, but how will history judge us right now for what we're doing? And I think the ability to talk to people, and here's the hard part, is Vonnie and I, right, had a pre-existing relationship that we could just sit down and talk. And we knew where each other's intentions lied. And they both lied at what was best for our community and what was best for the people that we serve and the people that we're around. And without trust, without people outside of maybe your framework of who you're comfortable with, like you just talk to people who think like you and act like you and affirm your beliefs and affirm your thoughts. So we have to be uncomfortable and be willing to listen to other people, but also be willing to disagree but not hate.
Yeah.
Like I can disagree with you, but I can still love you.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's, again, it's back to all or none society right now. Like I have to be all this or not that, and I think we just are at a point where more conversation, more broadening, and I think that's where we have to teach our kids a little bit to say, well, maybe you don't need to identify yourself as X, Y, or Z.
Right.
You just identify yourself as a community member of Sioux Falls, striving what's best for your community, and let some of the other stuff kind of shed away. And I think it's hard because, again,
Yeah.
we look at our society right now and when we fall into those camps, it's just very difficult to have any fruitful conversation, to have any compromise.
Well, I think if you're like me, you probably had some questions that came up in your mind as they were talking, and then the discussion went a different direction. But there's probably a place for people to respond to either one of you.
Yeah, you can just have us back sometime.
Yeah, we will
mean,
absolutely. How about a year from now and see what you see the trajectory of our community?
You can just put us on a recurring schedule. This is fun,
Okay.
actually.
We would love to do that. In fact, I think our pastor, if he's still back there, would probably say you just hit on all of the points that he made in the sermon today.
Oh.
Listen more, talk less.
Yeah.
Find your place in the community with your skills. And so, thank you so much.
No, it's
both of you,
wise
for coming.
words. Yeah. And I think, like, on that note, just one more point. We get so sucked into national conversations, but to pretend like Sioux Falls has anything to do, I'm just going to pick Los Angeles, right? Portland, Seattle. Like, we are just completely different makeups. We are completely different issues that are at place. And if we get sucked into national conversations and don't focus on those things locally, where are we really putting our energy, you know, into something that really can't be usable? And so, yeah, it's good. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that